important figure in the English church, and who was obviously a very important figure in the life of Lewis Carroll, being essentially his teacher for the first 11 years or so of his life. But it was so exciting to come across so many new materials that other biographers had not had a chance to look at. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. I got a book. Let me see if I can find it here. I got this book right here. I don't know if you can see what that says. It says Lessons from School Life. So this is a book of sermons that were delivered by Lewis Carroll's headmaster and housemaster at Rugby School during the time period that Lewis Carroll was at Rugby School. I read a lot of sermons that he listened to as a child and as a young adult and as an adult. And what's amazing about this book, there's so many things that are amazing about this book, because there's so many places where you see Dodgson's future ideas about religion and about life being formed. But there's one sermon in particular that really struck me, and that was when one of the schoolmasters had passed away a few days earlier, and Mr. Tate, the future Archbishop of Canterbury, rises to the pulpit, and on about the third sentence of his sermon, he says, "What is life? Is it just a dream?" I almost fell out of my chair when I read this, because the notion of life being a dream and waking from that dream being our waking to immortal life shows up in many, many different places in Lewis Carroll's book. He talks about life as a dream in poems after Through the Looking Glass. He talks about it in Sylvia and Bruno. He talks about it in the Easter greeting. And I thought, he learned this idea when he was 15 years old, sitting in the pews in the chapel at Rugby School. So there were many places like that where, looking at a new piece of source material, I was able to make connections that I don't think had been made in the past. And there were other sources that came forth that were really exciting. I first found there was another book of sermons that Tate wrote for the boys at Rugby when they were preparing for their confirmation. Nothing had been written, as far as I knew, by anybody about Lewis Carroll's confirmation, and I wrote a whole chapter about the person who prepared him for confirmation, who was his tutor all the way through Rugby School, and yet doesn't show up in any of the other biographies. But I couldn't find a copy of this book of sermons by Headmaster Tate. Well, I thought, it wasn't in WorldCat, it wasn't in any university libraries, but I thought maybe because Tate went on to become Archbishop of Canterbury, and the seat of Archbishop of Canterbury is Lambeth Palace in London, maybe Lambeth Palace has a library, maybe they have an archive. Well, they do. And they did have a copy of the book, and they sent me a scan of it. Then the next time I was in London, I went to Lambeth Palace, and I discovered not just that book, but all the manuscript sermons and lectures that Tate had given to the boys at Rugby during the time that Lewis Carroll was there, were right there, sitting about 200 yards from the building in which the Lewis Carroll Society in England was founded. And yet nobody had looked at these in 150 years. So that was really exciting to come across materials like that. I also was able to obtain some materials from my own collection that were really helpful. This was a notebook I tracked down that belonged to the other Mr. Tate, the headmaster of Richmond School when Lewis Carroll was a student there. And it's got some notes and things of sermons and talks that he gave to the boys at that time. So it gives a real insight into what Lewis Carroll was learning at his grammar school. And then, of course, there were the works of his father. This is the only surviving copy of his father's pamphlet about preparing for confirmation, at least until one of you tells me that you have one. So I'm sure somebody will correct me on that, but it's certainly a rare item. And then there's simply new sources that were available to the biographer of the 2010s that were not available to previous biographers, the digitized sources online. I was able to really flesh out the work and life of Lewis Carroll's father, because he was a part of numerous organizations where he would go and give speeches at gatherings for like the local school board or things like that. And these speeches would be transcribed into the newspapers. Well, back when I used to go to Colindale in North London and look through giant volumes of newspapers, one page at a time, trying to find Lewis Carroll items, it would have taken 100 people a century to track these things down. And now we have digitized newspaper archives and searchable images. And I was able to find a huge amount of new material about Lewis Carroll's father and his ideas about parish life, about education, about so many things that come into play in Lewis Carroll's own life. And so that's been it was a really interesting book to work on. It has, at one point, I had actually was thinking about trying to recreate Lewis Carroll's unfinished book about religious difficulties, but finally I realized that, first of all, that was giving me a book that was been, sort of a 2-volume doorstop. And so I tried to sort of just fold some of that material into more of a standard biography. I think you'll find that if you're interested in Lewis Carroll, I hope you'll be interested in this book. It is there's some material there that will be familiar to you. The basic timeline is familiar. That we were born in Daresbury and we moved to Croft and were educated at Richmond and Rugby and Oxford, and then we, take a rowing trip down the Thames. All of that is there, but viewed through a very different lens. I'll give you one more example, and then I'm gonna open it up for questions of one of the connections I got. Again, this comes through the idea of context. So we all know the story of the river trip on the 4th of July, 1862. It's told again and again and again as this quiet, lovely summer day on the river. But when we back up our focus a little bit, we find out that that day was actually in the middle of a really busy week. It was commemoration week. Lewis Carroll had a house guest who'd been with him for 10 days or so at that point. He and his house guest went to London the next day to go to the International Exposition, where there were tens of thousands of people. They'd been to commemoration events earlier in the week with thousands of people. And the river trip took place on a Friday, and on a day earlier in the week, I think maybe it was Tuesday, I can't remember, there was a church service at the University Church. The church was packed to overflowing. And Edward Bouverie Pusey, Lewis Carroll's father's friend and Lewis Carroll's sort of sponsor at Christ Church, gave the sermon. And in the course of this sermon, he talked about the idea essentially of divine inspiration. And I should have pulled the quote out to tell you this, but basically he uses exactly the same words that Lewis Carroll will use years later when he talks about how he wrote the Alice books. Pusey talks about divine inspiration as when something comes of itself, through no effort of our own. It simply comes to us. And Lewis Carroll uses these same words when he's talking about the origins of Alice in Wonderland and of Through the Looking Glass and of the final line of The Hunting of the Snark. And so again, we see these connections between the parts of Lewis Carroll's life and legacy and works that we know intimately, and the part of his life that was so intimate to him, that being his religious life. So I also have chapters on Lewis Carroll as a preacher. I actually was able to find a previously unknown sermon of Lewis Carroll's. We previously didn't have the full text of a sermon, so that was really exciting to find that. Lewis Carroll's prayer life. I looked really in detail at the diary prayers in particular, and showed how they were connected to simply the standard life of Anglican prayer and the Book of Common Prayer. So there's chapters on various aspects of his adult life as well. I think I'm gonna leave it there because it's 3:30, which means we're technically about halfway through, and I hope we're gonna have questions. I'm gonna pull up my little question box here and see if we have any questions already. Oh gosh, there's like a really long.
Do you want me to summarize that question for you, Charlie?
Yeah, if you want to summarize that question, it's like about a 20-sentence long question. I think maybe
so
it's
I read it, and basically regarding the headmaster's sermons at Rugby School, Daniel asks, what about Life is a Dream? It was a Spanish language play by Pedro Calderón de la Barca, first published in 1636. And basically, story focuses on someone who's been imprisoned in a tower by his father, and at the end, the father imprisons him again and persuades him that indeed it was all just a dream. So that's from even 1630.
Certainly the notion of life as a dream is not anything that was invented by either Archibald Campbell Tate or by Charles Dodgson, but it just fascinates me to see him using that in a very overtly religious way, especially in the Easter greeting of 1876, where he really specifically, compares the idea of life being a dream and then waking from that dream being waking to eternal life. That really can be traced right back to this sermon that was given when he was 15 years old. And so there are many moments like that. Again, I'm going to open question window, because I think there might be more coming in. Yeah.
I love the Easter greeting from 1876. It's one of my favorite pieces
Yeah.
of writing by him.
So
I read it every Easter on my Instagram.
Brian Riddle writes, what was the most problematic religious difficulty that Dodgson Carroll faced during his lifetime? Was it Darwinism or something else? I don't know that. I mean, if we judge it from his writings, the thing that he comes back to again and again and again is his discomfort with the idea of eternal punishment, which was essentially dogma in the English church at the time. So for Dodgson, who was ordained into the English church and who himself often made the point that that meant that what my bishop tells me to believe and do is what I believe in and do. For him to take a public stance saying that a just and loving God would never punish someone infinitely for sins that by their very nature must be finite. That was a bold thing for him to do. So I think it was something that troubled him, and he came at it, as he came at so many different things, as a logician. He came at it from a logical point of view, and he gave both late in life. He was invited to give sermons at St. Mary's Church, the University Church, to a regular gathering of undergraduates. And it wasn't the university sermon on Sunday morning, but it was still a pretty big deal. He gave two of these sermons. One of them was on the subject of reverence, which was something that was very close to his heart from almost his earliest writings. We see him talking about concern about holy things being taken lightly or jokes being made about passages in the Bible. So that was one of them. And the other sermon he gave, his last sermon, was on the subject of eternal punishment. And he actually wrote what would have been a chapter in that book on religious difficulties, got as far as being printed in galley proofs. And so we have a really good sense of what that sermon was like and what the argument that he made was. So Brian, I don't know if that was what gave him personally the most trouble, but it was certainly the thing that he wasted the most, not wasted, but used the most ink on. And he wrote, there's several letters that he wrote to family members and to others where we can sort of see him working out his ideas about eternal punishment. Cindy Waters says, wait a minute, hang on. Cindy Waters says, I love the story of how you found the sermons. Do you have any other discovery tales? Oh gosh, Cindy, there's, some of them are pretty boring because it's like, I'm searching in a newspaper in an archive and ding, 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 I find something. But I was talking to Heather earlier that it's always good to have, in the Bookman's Tale, one librarian gives some advice to another librarian, and he says, if you're going to be a serious bookman, you need to have a guy at the British Library on the inside. When I wrote that, I didn't have a guy at the British Library. But after the Bookman's Tale was published in England, the English publisher sent it to a friend of his who was a Renaissance librarian at the British Library. And that librarian invited Janice and myself to come and have a sort of behind the scenes tour. I'll never forget, we were standing in, this way beneath the ground in this archive. We happened to be standing in front of the part of the BBC radio archive. And I just randomly pulled a reel of tape off of the shelf in this box to see what it was. And it said, The Hobbit, adapted by Brian Sibley. And I'm like, of all the millions of things that are in the British Library. But anyhow, Stephen became my guy at the British Library. And when, for instance, I thought that I was going to find some more information about Lewis Carroll, maybe including some information that I didn't know about him as a preacher, in an article in a very obscure journal that only existed in the British Library. I could have, spent days going online, filling out the forms, figuring out how to pay the £2.47 fee for having photocopies sent to me. But instead, I emailed Stephen. He called the book up, took pictures of it with his phone, and I had the article on my desk the next day. So it turns out it is nice to have a guy on the inside of the British Library. Linda Gray Moyne says, how would you contrast Charles's own religious belief system with that of his father's? I wrote a whole book about that, is the easiest answer to the question, Linda, because I think too often those people who have looked at Lewis Carroll's religious life have looked at it as a photograph and not as a film, a video, something that covers time and that changes over time. I think I would characterize his religious views as reasonably closely aligned to his father when he was a younger man and his father was still alive, and much more liberal and open-minded than his father when he was an older man and his father had been dead for many years. That's the short answer to the question. The long answer is like 260 pages long, because in a way you could make the argument that that's what this whole book is about, because I really do start out very focused on Lewis Carroll's father, because there's just so much new material there, and it's so important that we get it out there for people to read and evaluate. All right, let's see. Why did Carroll accept theater going, unlike many clergy? Again, he writes about this in some length. He sort of defends this. And Carroll certainly had strong artistic tendencies, and he loved the theater. But what he loved most about the theater was that he thought at its best that it could uplift us, that it could make us better, that it could reveal sin for what it really is, and it could also celebrate human goodness. And when theater is doing that, he loves it, and he can rightly make the claim that it aligns to his religious beliefs. Theater didn't always do that, and Lewis Carroll was quick to call it out when it didn't do that, and when it was irreverent or something like that. And so, again, that's a complicated question, and that's something that I write. At one point, I had a whole chapter that was just about theater, and now it's a section within a chapter. But okay, let's see. Hang on a second. I'm trying to get back to my questions. Your question got cut off if you want to resubmit.
Oh, yeah, don't ignore that part. Actually, may I piggyback on that last question?
Yeah, absolutely. Please do.
And I apologize if this is kind of basic and has been talked about to death, but I feel like when the question comes up as to why he did not become a full reverend, and do we have more information on that, or is that still somewhat of a mystery?
Okay, so that's another thing. Hang on just a second. I'm texting my wife to come get the dog because the dog's going crazy. Okay. That's something where I have not a whole chapter, but a large section on. And it has been, sometimes people say, well, it's just because he wanted to go to the theater and his bishop let him go to the theater. Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I have gone through every single thing I can find that Samuel Wilberforce wrote, and I can't find out anything about theater going. Now, he does say, that you can't spend your time in worldly pursuits and things like this. So, I can imagine that being the case. I think it's, again, I don't think there's a simple answer. I think it's complicated. He even himself admitted that it was complicated, but I think, and again, when we broaden our view, we see it wasn't just that he never went from being a deacon to being a priest, but it actually took him a lot longer just to become a deacon than everybody else who became a deacon that he went to Christ Church with, like by years longer, So I think it was something that was going on early on, but I think when you look at the critical period, the period when he was deciding whether to go from the diaconate to the priesthood, and when he was sort of acting like he was going to, preaching a lot, all this kind of stuff. We see several different things that happened during that period. One, most interesting to us perhaps, he suddenly became a children's writer, and perhaps saw this as a career path that he might not feel was commensurate with being a priest. Two, he went on this Russian journey with his dear friend Liddon, and they had lots of conversations about what it meant to be a priest, and in some cases Dodgson kind of didn't like what he heard, it seemed like. I don't think Dodgson was ever really cut out for parish life. I don't think he ever would have been a parish priest, but he could easily have been a priest who continued to teach at Oxford, like as he did.
But what I find interesting, oh, sorry.
Three, his father died. And I think if anybody in his life was pressuring him to become a priest, it would have been his father. And really at the time that his father dies, is when we see it cut off. And there are other factors that come in there too. So I think there are a lot of different factors. I think it's a fascinating question. I tried to deal with it as deeply and broadly as I could, because I don't think it's a question we can dismiss by just saying he wanted to go to the theater or he didn't want to be a parochial priest. I think it's a complicated question, and one which he gave a lot of thought to over a period of many years. Yeah.
But what I find interesting, I think the bigger question for me has always been, but why was he allowed to not become a priest? Like, wasn't that the rules? Like, were there any other dons that did not become priests?
Complicated too. It's sort of dependent on how you looked at it. And it's really funny that the dean said to him on one day, you know, not only do you have to become a priest, but you probably should have already done it. You know, you may be out of a job now. And Dodgson said, well, I'd like to take this to the, you know, to the broader committee or whatever. And then the next day, the dean is like, don't worry about it.
Right? Yeah,
I think that's the really interesting question. What made Dean Little change his mind? What conversations did he have?
exactly. What went on in the deanery?
It
Pointing the
wasn't
wrong
quite
way
as
here.
wasn't quite as cut and dry as it looks, because there are clerical fellowships and
Okay.
clerical studentships and non-clerical studentships. And there was some question as to whether Dodgson's studentship was a clerical studentship, and there's some question as to whether being a deacon satisfies the parameters of a clerical studentship. So it was not a binary question. You know, there was some more gray area, but yeah, somebody says, is there a contradiction in the diaries? Doesn't he say he will not study for the priesthood, but then we see him actually studying for the priesthood? Yeah, he goes back and forth a lot. Who of us don't? I've probably said plenty of times in the past 10 years, I'm not going to write this book. It's too much trouble. And then I keep getting sucked back into it. So, you know, as a writer, I can tell you, the thinking you're not going to do things one day and then changing your mind the next day, that's just par for the course for us creative crazies. So well, he certainly does contradict himself, but I don't think there's anything, you know, nefarious about that. Somebody says, how do you interpret those diary entries where he criticizes himself? I think this might be a reference to some of the diary prayers, and this is something that some people have had trouble with, and I think most of the people who've had trouble with them are maybe, I'm guessing, I don't want to criticize anybody unduly, but I think they may be mostly people who haven't grown up in or spent a lot of time in an Anglican church tradition. If you, I mean, I certainly did. And so Lewis Carroll's diary prayers immediately looked very familiar to me, because they're extremely similar to, in some cases, they actually borrow language directly from prayers in the Book of Common Prayer. We also see there's a family prayer book that either his father or mother wrote, that's in the family collection at Guildford. And we see in those few family prayers, an absolute pattern and template for the prayers that would come in his diaries and in his prayer life later on. But the standard in Anglican prayer is, you know, we are called upon, certainly as clergymen and even as lay people, we are and in Victorian times, this is certainly true, we are called upon to read morning and evening services, morning prayer and evening prayer. This was a shortening of the 7 services that were done in monasteries in the Middle Ages, that was done when the Book of Common Prayer was written by Thomas Cranmer at the time of the Reformation. We're called upon to read those 2 services, and in those services, that includes the confession of sin, and the confession of sin is very similar to the diary prayers, where he recognizes his own failures. In some cases, I would say that the language in the prayer book is more harsh. You know, we're called miserable sinners, and we have erred and strayed from thy ways like lost sheep. And we do that in the morning, and then, you know, 8 hours later, we do it again, because we've sinned since that morning. So I think if you consider those passages in the light of Anglican theology, Anglican liturgy, and the Anglican prayer life, they fit right in. And also, certainly, if you compare them to the diaries of other Victorian clergymen, Archibald Campbell Tate, for instance, kept the diary that's in manuscript at Lambeth Palace during the time that he was at Rugby. And oh my gosh, the stuff! And this is a guy who went on to become the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's like, you know, a priest leading this boys' school, and he just comes down on himself like a ton of bricks almost every day. Much more harsh on himself than Lewis Carroll is in his diaries. So there's nothing unusual about it. It fits in both with the pattern of Victorian diaries written by clergymen, and it fits in very much with the pattern of Anglican prayer, confession, and absolution. Okay, in the spirit of replacing Victorian sternness with always teaching lessons to children, Carroll beautifully encouraged fun for children's literature. What have you found to be a pivotal message of spirituality that you believe to be critical for children and included in his works? Well, I think it's what, by the end of his life, Lewis Carroll felt so strongly. I mean, he feels this all along, and we see it from the very earliest days at Daresbury, being part of his education. But it becomes for him the central pillar of his Christian faith, and the one that he most wanted to share with children. And that is simply the love of God. That the central attribute of God is love, and that love is unconditional, and is offered to everyone, and that children should rejoice in that rather than fearing this judgmental God looking over their shoulder, watching everything that they're doing, which is another thing that was part of his upbringing in Daresbury. So I think that in terms of his relationship with children, that absolutely, and really in terms of his entire faith life, that is what he came to believe, that the loving God is what you should focus on much more than the judgmental God. All right, Chris Morgan says, do you have a favorite funny quote from Carroll in volume 6? Oh my gosh. Okay, so one of the new pieces that I found was a letter to the editor called The Cab Runner Nuisance. And the first thing I had to find out is, what are cab runners? Well, there were these guys who would hang around outside the mainline railway stations, and when a young lady or a young lady with her female companion, somebody without a man, would get into a cab, and these are horse-drawn vehicles with luggage, the cab runners would run after the cab and chase them. And then when they arrived at their lodgings, they would offer to unload the luggage for them in exchange for payment. And sometimes people were happy to have this, but sometimes it was a bit of a nuisance. Well, Lewis Carroll comes up with this whole thing about this whole like sting operation where, like, okay, so what you do is you get somebody in the house next door who's like a big burly guy, and then you have him come, and then you go out, and just the way he describes it is just so funny to think of him sitting at home thinking up this comic, almost Monty Python-esque response to, you know, just sort of a typical urban annoyance, like people in New York City watching your windshields or whatever. You know, part of it, I think, for me is because it was a totally new piece I'd never seen, that I discovered in the search for this book. But in part of it's just to see that his sense of humor can come out anywhere. Once volume 6 is out, is there a plan to regularize and combine the indices of all 6 volumes and publish a combined index? I think that's from Claire or August. I think that would be a great project for you guys. Go for it. I hope that yeah, that we'll be able to do something like that. Edward Giuliano says, any new context or insights on Lewis Carroll's take on Darwin or the debates on evolution? You know, I think that's one of those areas. I tried to focus as much as possible on areas where either there was new material or where people hadn't focused in the past. I feel like that's an area where people had given some attention in the past. And it wasn't an area where Dodgson wasted a lot of ink. I mean, he certainly responded to things like, when you think of the controversies of the day, both he and his father were probably more cued into things like the Gorham controversy, or the controversy over essays and reviews, which was a book of essays that some people considered, you know, some of them might be heretical, you know, and so I try to sort of follow his lead rather than saying, here's an interesting Victorian topic, you know, let's try to figure out what Lewis Carroll thought about it. I try to follow his lead and let him tell me what he was actually interested in, what the things that were the most important to him, and follow it in that direction. Claire asked if Lewis Carroll appreciated Eastern religious thought. I don't know if he appreciated it, but it's fascinating to look at the books in his library. He did own quite a few books about world religions and other religions. And it's, you know, because he owned those books doesn't mean that we know what he thought about those things, but he certainly knew about a variety of religions. We do see as a young man, when he's on the Russian journey, that he has a certain condescension for the high ritual of Catholicism and the Eastern Orthodox Church. I mean, there's a passage in the Russian journal where in a span of about 2 sentences, he completely fails to understand genuflection, rosary beads, and a Sanctus bell. You know, so yeah, but he does make an issue of saying, like, it's okay for Jewish kids to read Alice in Wonderland, or you know, I even have a friend who's a Quaker, you know. So I think, you know, in a time when certainly among Anglican clergy, there was a very narrow focus of what constituted reasonable religion, I guess you would say. He was more open-minded than many, more curious than many. But whether that means, I can't remember exactly how the question was worded, whether that means he appreciated Eastern religions, I think that might be pushing it just a bit. It's interesting to look at one of the books that he read when he was a child. It's a book about sort of life around the world. And this is in the, the 1830s. And what it says about world religions is just wildly xenophobic, and we would find really offensive today. But I did pull out some quotes from that book because I thought it was important for us to understand that even though now we would find that to be really unenlightened, it was important to understand where he was starting from, so that if he got to the point where he said, I even have a friend who's a Quaker, that was actually making a lot of progress for somebody at that time who grew up the way he did. Does examining Dodgson's life through a religious lens and his own religious faith change the way you or readers ought to understand the Alice books? That's chapter, I want to say chapter 9 in Lewis Carroll, Formed by Faith. I feel like when you, especially in the case of Alice in Wonderland, and especially in the case of Alice's Adventures Underground, which is an extemporaneous story. I mean, I know this as a storyteller. When you tell an extemporaneous story, no matter how hard you try to make it be just nonsense, your self comes out in that story. And while I would never claim that Lewis Carroll, in telling the Underground story, was trying to say anything about religion, and he says he wasn't trying to say anything about religion, and I think he's right. He also says about the meaning of the hunting of the Snark, our words mean a great deal more than we mean them to when we write them down, or something along those lines. And I think if you were a person of deep faith who grew up listening to Bible stories every single day, who grew up deeply immersed in Anglican liturgy and went to services twice on Sundays, and whose father was a clergyman, and then you're telling an extemporaneous story, those things come out. And so, yeah, I mean, on the face of it, Alice begins with a fall and ends with a resurrection. Okay, Alice has a baptism in it. Alice has an examining chaplain in the form of a caterpillar in it, who gives her something to eat that changes her in a fundamental way. We call that the Eucharist in the Christian church. I'm not saying that Lewis Carroll put any of that stuff in there on purpose, but I'm saying it is certainly possible to look at, especially Alice's Adventures Underground, the extemporaneous story, as having lots and lots of elements of Lewis Carroll's life and self in it, because it's an extemporaneous story and that's what happens. And some of those elements relate to his religious life and his upbringing. Did you find anything in the pamphlets referring to the volume on his shelf entitled, and then I don't have the rest of the answer. Oh, esoteric Buddhism. No, I think that kind of goes back to the question about Eastern religions. It fascinates me that Lewis Carroll had books about theosophy, that he had books about Mormonism. It wasn't just like major world religions he had books about. He had books about, now the books that he had about Mormonism were pretty anti-Mormon books, but nonetheless, he had them on his shelf. It's dangerous to draw too many conclusions from the fact that a book was on Lewis Carroll's shelf, especially if it's a book that was published before 1868, because we don't really know what happened to Lewis Carroll's father's library. But more than likely, most of those books ended up on the shelves of his clergyman sons, of whom Lewis Carroll was one. And Lewis Carroll was the academic son. And Lewis Carroll was the oldest son, and one, I mean, Edwin would have been too young in 1868 to pass religious books on to, theology books and things. And so there's a good chance that that a number of the books, many of the books in Lewis Carroll's library published before 1868 may well have come from his father's library. So I think we have to be careful drawing too many conclusions just from the presence of a book in his library if there's no other evidence. Now, if we see a pattern of he had books on a certain topic that over a period of years, including after 1868, that's probably not just something that somebody left in his rooms and it ended up on his shelf. It's probably something he was genuinely interested in. But again, we have to be a little bit careful about how we draw conclusions about specific things that were in his library. Yeah. Okay, Heather, I think we've worked through those questions.
I think we did. And you know what you're saying
Well,
about the
sure.
books on Lewis Carroll's shelf, it reminded me of an article I just read that you shouldn't judge people by the books that are on their shelves on their Zoom call. You don't know, they could belong to other people in the household.
Background. Oh, but
Exactly.
my wife is an expert at pausing like an interview on MSNBC or something and going, isn't that book that, didn't you have that guy on your podcast, that book that's back behind him, even from the spine, she's great at
That's great.
so be careful out there, people.
Yes, and also Matthew made a note that speaking of God with the burning hell behind you is an interesting touch. I actually thought Charlie had a virtual background like I did, but that is a real fireplace behind him.
Yeah.
And
we're having about a 65 or 70 degree day today, and I'm sitting out on the back porch.
That's lovely.
I wish you all were here. Many of you have been here in the past, and I hope Janice and I were just talking the other day, like of all the things that are new in Winston-Salem that we could share with the Lewis Carroll Society the next time you're here. We have a fantastic new downtown public library. We have a fantastic new Bookmarks, our great independent bookstore with a great gathering space, and we can't wait to have you back here in person when the time comes.
Yes, we all definitely look forward to that. And you did just mention your podcast, which I was remiss in your introduction and not mentioning it. It is wonderful. It's called Inside the Writer's Studio. And I will admit that I heard that title about 10 times before I made the connection to Inside the Actor's Studio. That's okay. Pandemic brain going on here. But at the end, you ask writers 10 questions. I was wondering if I could ask you those just at the end here for some fun.
Hey, I think this is the third time I've been asked these 10 questions, but with a new novel out, I've got other people interviewing me, and they're starting to turn the tables on me. But I promise you that I answer them differently every time. So
all right, here we go. What word do you love to work into your writing?
I like plethora, especially if I can work dearth in at the same time.
What word do you hate to encounter in other people's writing?
I hate to encounter meaningless modifiers like very or definitely.
Where is your favorite place to write? Maybe right there on your porch?
I have a studio right upstairs that looks out over my back garden, and that is where I do most of my work.
Where could you never write?
Any place with a loud television playing in the background. I don't know which would be worse, a news station that aligns with my political views or a news station that doesn't align with my political views, but either one of them would be tough. I'm amazed how many authors answer that question by saying Starbucks, because we have this vision that authors go down to the coffee shop to write. That's like the most common answer is I couldn't work in a coffee shop.
Oh, that's just screenwriters here in LA. That's who goes to the Starbucks. To what rule of grammar do you pay least attention?
In academic writing, I try to pay attention to all of them, but in my novels, probably sentence fragments. I think a good sentence fragment can really pack a punch, especially at the end of a paragraph or at the end of a chapter.
I'm a big fan of the run-on myself. Let's see. What is the first book you remember reading?
The first book I remember being able to sit down and read all by myself was Go Dog Go, which still is a classic,
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, mine was like Long Dog, Short, or Big Dog, Short Dog. It was same series, I believe. Yeah. That's amazing. What are you reading now?
Right now, I'm reading the new Anthony Horowitz book called Moonflower Murders. He's the guy who wrote Magpie Murders, a British crime writer. And I'm interviewing Alexander McCall Smith on the podcast in about 10 days. So I'm reading his new book. And I'm listening to Alex Trebek's memoir when I'm out running. So that's my current audio book that I got going.
Nice. What book would you like to have written?
Well, for this group, you almost have to say Alice in Wonderland, but I don't know. Maybe I would like to have written The Life and Letters of Lewis Carroll that was written by his nephew, because then that means I would have known all those people.
Yeah. What sort of book would you like to write, but probably never will?
Probably like a full-on fantasy, Lord of the Rings, create your own entire world kind of thing. I'm in awe of people who are world builders.
Excellent. And the last one, besides, hey, I work at the British Library, can I be your guy? What would you like to hear a reader tell you?
So I think with this group of readers, I would say I would love to hear a reader tell me, I never knew that about Lewis Carroll. That fascinated me, or that opened up a new angle of interest for me. I came to Lewis Carroll originally as somebody who just collected editions of Alice in Wonderland and didn't know anything about Lewis Carroll. And the last 35 years have been this gradual unfolding of a fascination. And if I can be a little part of somebody else's journey like that, that would be great.
Good answer. And actually, we have one more question that was submitted that maybe we can add at the end here. What do you think? Do we know how many different types of religious services that he attended in his life? That's from Ellie.
Okay, so in the Anglican practice, he would have attended, especially at Oxford, he would have attended daily morning prayer, which is a fairly short service. On some days, that service was sung by the choir, in which case it's called matins, and it would be a little bit longer if it's a sung service. In the evenings, not always there, but often in the evenings, he would have attended evening prayer. These are also services that a clergyman can simply read from the prayer book in the privacy of their own rooms. And actually, technically, as a deacon, he was required to read them every day, although he had an argument with Liddon about that requirement, and he took issue with it. So we would have had morning and evening prayer, and in my book, I sort of parse those services and tell you kind of how they're built up. But essentially, they each include a couple of scripture readings, a psalm, some standard prayers, confession of sin, absolution, and that's about it. Then there's the Eucharist service. Now at the time, the Eucharist was not. Now, if you go into most Episcopal or Anglican churches, the Eucharist is celebrated every week. In the Victorian times, they were coming out of the 18th century when it was celebrated rarely, and the Oxford movement was trying to sort of bring back a more regular celebration of the Eucharist. And so he went to Eucharist services on a very regular basis, maybe not every week, but on a very regular basis, and often, or on many occasions, would assist with serving the Eucharist, especially if he got to the church and he realized that the priest, there were just more people than he could handle. He would go up and offer to be the person who passes around the cup or passes the plate. And so all three of those services, morning prayer, evening prayer, Eucharist, could also have been sung services, in case matins, evensong, and then a sung Eucharist. So those were the basic services that he would have attended. He certainly attended baptism services. He baptized several children during his time. Wedding services, he was involved in as a clergyman in a couple of those for family members. Funeral services, burial services, pretty much any services in the Book of Common Prayer, he went to it at some case. But the regular services are morning and evening prayer and the Eucharist, and then the others are sort of services for more special occasions. And then he would occasionally go to services somewhere else. He would maybe once in a while go to a Catholic church to see what that was like. That was more common, especially on the Russian tour. Although it's interesting, on the Russian journey, pretty soon he gets to the point where like he goes to the Catholic church for 20 minutes to hear the music, and then goes off looking for the English church in Berlin or wherever they are to go to his Anglican service. So in a nutshell, those would have been the services that he would have attended regularly.
And that was actually, you just answered the second part of Ellie's question was, did he ever go to places, Jewish, Catholic, Muslim services? So you answered that there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best place to look for those is in the Russian journey, because that's certainly where he had the most opportunity. There wasn't a mosque in Guildford, there wasn't, I don't believe there was a mosque in Oxford, so when he had the most opportunity to do those sort of things was when he was on that journey through Western and then Eastern Europe, and then all the way to Moscow. And so if you want to see his comments about those experiences, that's the best place to look. I could have written a whole book about the Russian journey. That was, in fact, I struggled with sort of how to include, there was so much there, how to include what was there, and it sort of pops up at different places in the book. But it is certainly the place where we see him doing the most sort of peeking in at other types of religious celebration.
Excellent. And Dana asked the question I was afraid someone was going to ask: when will these books be available?
Okay, so here's the thing. So the pamphlets, I think we'll be sending out an email blast before too long. I think the pamphlets will probably be available in early 2021. That's our hope. I'll tell you, both of these books are being published either in conjunction with or simply by the University Press of Virginia. And this has been a really hard year for university presses. Many of them are on campuses that have been completely shut down at one point or another. Many of them are on campuses where only essential staff are allowed to come into work. There's also been huge backups in printing companies because printing companies were shut down for a couple of months earlier in the year, and some of them get shut down again if there's an outbreak. So it's made it much more difficult to answer that question than it usually is. My expectation is that the pamphlets, you'll get an email blast about that sometime in the next 6 weeks, and that we should be able to put that book in your hands in the first quarter of 2021, if not sooner. The Lewis Carroll Formed by Faith, I know a little bit less about, but let me tell you this: if you are interested in owning a copy of Lewis Carroll Formed by Faith, if you will send me an email, you can do it through my website at charlielovett.com. Just send me a message and say, I'm interested in this book, and give me your email. I'll be sure to have you on a list I mean, I'm sure we'll send out an email blast to the whole society, but if you want to be the first to know, I'll put you on a list to be the first to know. But the original expectation from UVA was that book would be, we signed the contract. I think we signed the contract back in the spring, like sort of right before COVID happened, because you've got to go through all these peer reviews and everything. And I had fantastic peer reviewers who really helped me make the book a better book and much more readable and more focused. But you go through a lot of things before you end up signing the contract. So we signed the contract back in the spring, and the idea was it would come out in the spring of 2021. We'll see if that holds. I think worst case scenario is it would come out. It would be on the fall list, but maybe be available, late summer or something like that. So those are my expectations now. But my expectations a year ago were, a lot different from what reality has played out. So we'll just have to roll with the punches, and we will get these books to you as soon as we can.
Excellent. And a great way to keep tabs on things like that is to follow the Lewis Carroll Society of North America's social media accounts. If you all are not doing that already, on Twitter, we're at Alice America. Instagram, we are Lewis Carroll Society America. And I wasn't trying to co-opt both continents with those usernames. It's just there's limits on how long your name can be. And then we're easy to find on Facebook. And if I may say, I have noticed on Facebook recently, the algorithm is not being kind to us. Like things that used to get maybe 50 to 70 likes are now like hardly getting double digits. Couldn't possibly be the content, because I do the content. But so I would recommend, if you want to make sure you don't miss a post from us, if you already like our page, go to the actual page and you can hit the 3 little dots to the right of the screen and you can hit follow, and that will ensure, and then you can choose whether you want it to be a favorite or to always be at the top of your feed. But yeah, we're definitely not showing up in as many people's feeds as we used to, unfortunately. And that is also a good place to find out about our future virtual events. I know you all enjoyed this today, so you're going to want to come to our events in December and January. They're a little more casual than this. It's more of a party atmosphere. In December, we are going to have a Carrollian show and tell, where you can show your favorite bit of Alice memorabilia. We're calling it like the best Alice gift I ever got, but it doesn't have to be a gift. It can be something you bought yourself. It can be a priceless artifact. It can be a homemade arts and crafts. We did something like this at the spring meeting a few years ago at USC. We called it Pop-Up Wonderland, and it was really fun. So you'll be able to participate in that. So be on the lookout in your email. We'll be setting up a sign-up form for that. And then January, we are doing a Looking Glass cocktail party. And that is going to kick off a whole year of celebrating the 150th anniversary of Looking Glass. And if you have any ideas for future events, you can message me at any of those social media channels I just mentioned, and also LCSNA social media at outlook.com if you prefer to email. And we're especially interested in Looking Glass themed virtual events for next year. All right, Charlie, you got anything else?
My publicist would be furious with me if I didn't hold this up and say, if you need something to read over the vacation, over the holidays, while your family is not traveling to see you, grab a copy of Escaping Dreamland, hardcover, audiobook. I just interviewed on my podcast the guy who recorded the audiobook. That was great fun. So if you're an audiobook fan, I would commend that podcast to you as well.
And do you ever do your own audiobooks?
I'm sorry, what?
Do you ever do your own audiobooks, or do you always
No,
hire someone
really,
else?
and if you want to know why, listen to the podcast, because it's really an art form unto itself, that I am not a master of, but it's really interesting to listen to what other people do with your books. I don't think we're going to do an audio book of Pamphlets Volume 6. It's a little disappointing, but I don't know. Who knows? Maybe we will. I'm,
600 pages. That could take a
all
while to
about
listen to.
making things available to people as much as possible. But anyhow, it's really lovely to see so many familiar names on that participant list. I wish I could see all your faces, but if I don't see you before then, have lovely holidays, and I hope I see all of you in person in 2021.
Yes, thank you so much, Charlie. And one, Edward Giuliano wanted to add, the pamphlets have been printed and bound seemingly finished yesterday.
Go.
What?
Okay, see,
Out
great.
to the public in early
Even
2021.
as we speak, if we stay on a little longer, maybe we'll start shipping them. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, Charlie. This is so fun.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks to everyone for attending. See you in December.